Welcome to Present Perfect. No grammar, but plenty of history. I'm Don Congdon, your host and guide, helping you explore how the past reaches out and touches the present. This is podcast number 114. Wait, Gardena in Geardigum, Thead Kuniga Threem Gefrunen, Hu tha Aethlingus Ellen Fremedon. I'm sure as I read that, all of you were mentally thinking, hark, the Speardane's glory through splendid achievements, the folk king's former fame we have heard of, how princes displayed their prowess in battle. After all, it's English, so it should have made perfect sense. If you had any trouble at all, you can blame it on my poor accent. I always feel that epic English poems should be read by someone who sounds like Gimli or maybe Lieutenant Commander Worf. All jesting aside, however, this poem, Beowulf, probably the oldest epic in English, demonstrates how much English has changed in the 14th century since it entered the British Isles. English is the topic of today's podcast. We're finally moving from the Mediterranean world of late antiquity to the Western European world of the early Middle Ages. From this point forward, we'll be looking at the Bible primarily from an English-speaking point of view. In order to understand how our English Bible came to us from the Latin and Greek-speaking world of the Roman Empire, we need to look at European history with an emphasis on the British Isles and the English language. In our last podcast, we examined the work of Jerome, which took place in the late 4th and early 5th centuries. This was still the time of the Roman Empire, although the empire was getting a little threadbare and the world was changing. The traditional perception is that Rome fell in 476 as a result of repeated invasions by the Goths, who came from what is now Eastern Europe. Rome went out like a dead light bulb and a dark age descended on Europe. Classical culture was lost until it was rediscovered during the Renaissance, which began in the early 1400s. The 900-year period in between these points was just castles, knights, the Black Death, and lots of misery. Most modern historians no longer take this view, as I've already hinted when I introduced the time periods called Late Antiquity and the Early Middle Ages. Remember, those two periods overlap. This reflects a newer thinking that sees the Roman world as transitioning into that of early modern Europe over a period of 2 centuries. Roman culture didn't sharply end and turn into medievalism. Neither do most modern historians use the term Dark Ages. So what did happen? We need to go back to 293 when Diocletian was emperor. At this point in time, the Roman Empire was getting a little cumbersome for one emperor to handle, so Diocletian decided to split it up into eastern and western parts. He similarly divided the ruling power among 4 men, 2 emperors and 2 sub-emperors. His new system didn't last long, but it set the pattern for a permanent division a century later. From that point on, Rome was divided into the Eastern and Western empires, each with a capital and emperor of its own. The eastern half was ruled from Constantinople, which today is called Istanbul. Rome remained the capital of the western half. As the 5th century began, conditions in the Western Empire weren't so good. Weak emperors, problems with the military, and poor administration were eroding what had once been a very efficient empire. Those pesky Goths repeatedly showed up and caused trouble. In 410, they sacked the city of Rome before moving on to other conquests. Many history books give 476 as the year that the Western Roman Empire ended. While it's true that the Goths deposed the emperor and took control of Italy in that year, it's incorrect to say that the Roman world came to a screeching halt. People didn't just take off their togas on January 1st, 477 and start acting like barbarians. Roman culture, laws, and governmental structure continued for more than 100 years. But a cultural shift was taking place, and it eventually led to a very different world. Perhaps you're wondering what happened to the Eastern Roman Empire. It survived and continued on for another 1,000 years before the Ottoman Turks ended it in the mid-1400s. But it too experienced a lot of changes, and after a while no longer looked like anything you'd consider Roman. It's also inaccurate and unfair to say that Europe descended into a dark age. This term entered our vocabulary during the Renaissance and became popular a few centuries later during the Enlightenment. It reflects the strong prejudice that historians of those periods felt when they compared the Middle Ages to their own time. Modern historians rarely use the term and have come to recognize that the Europe of the Middle Ages had a sophisticated culture of its own and not one to be despised. We'll discuss this subject again in later podcasts. For now, let's cross the English Channel and see what was going on in the British Isles. Britain of the late Roman Empire contained a culture that blended Celtic and Roman elements. The Romans first entered Britain in 55 BC under the famous general Julius Caesar. About a century later, Rome made Britain the westernmost part of their empire. Until the early 5th century, Roman legions maintained the peace, and a brisk trade developed between the native peoples and other parts of the empire. As the Western Roman Empire began to contract, Rome withdrew its troops from Britain, making it vulnerable to outside invasion and influence. Germanic peoples from mainland Europe began to migrate into Britain and assume political control. Traditionally, historians have assumed that there were major invasions into Britain by hordes of Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, but more recent scholarship favors the idea of a less dramatic takeover. Incidentally, the legend of King Arthur is a part of this period of history. Alas, it's almost entirely legend, even though many of us would like it to be otherwise. Whatever the exact circumstances, it's clear that by the 5th century, Germanic culture and language began to displace Romanized British culture. Latin and various Celtic languages gave way to a language that shares linguistic DNA with today's German, Dutch, Icelandic, and Norwegian. It's usually called Old English or Anglo-Saxon. Britain itself became known as Angleland, or England. The snippet of Beowulf that I read is in this form of English, and contrary to what some people believe, the King James Version of the Bible is not in Old English. Believe it or not, its language is actually a form of Modern English. The English language has a long and complicated linguistic history. Old English was just the first step. As you heard, it's quite different from its modern descendant, although if you listen carefully to a long passage, you'll pick up words here and there. Unlike our present-day language, which is mostly analytic and has few inflections, Old English was more synthetic and relied on inflections quite a bit. Old English experienced some changes in the 8th century when Scandinavian raiders from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden made periodic and unwelcome visits to England. Some of these Viking raiders eventually gave up pillaging and settled down to family life in England. Their language, a close relative to Old English, blended with the existing language, altering its grammar and vocabulary a bit. For this reason, Old English existed in several dialects that were spoken in different parts of England. Happily for historians and literary scholars, Old English was a written language, so we have a decent collection of examples from the time that it was in use, about 450 to 1100. The one copy of Beowulf that exists was produced around 1000. Among these manuscripts are translations of portions of the Bible. As far as we know, there never was a complete Old English Bible. Most of what we have are short translations from various books, the Gospels and the Psalms being the most common. These were translated from Latin versions of the Bible, not the original languages. They were probably produced as aids to clergy who had limited Latin skills and were used alongside the Latin text. Bede, a scholar and theologian from northern England, translated the Gospel of John into Old English in 735. Supposedly, he did this work on his deathbed and died the night after he finished it. No copy has survived. Education was a passion of the greatest Anglo-Saxon king, Alfred the Great. He founded a school to train young men and launched a program to translate useful Latin books into Old English. Over the next century, Alfred's descendants continued the program, leading to improved scholarship and a more literate England. The Wessex Gospels, which resulted from Alfred's translation program, is probably the most complete example that we have of an Old English Bible translation. Created near the end of the 10th century, it's a translation of the four Gospels into the West Saxon dialect of Old English. A number of copies survive, and digital images are available online. We also know of a translator named Elfric who translated the first 6 books of the Old Testament into English. Among the surviving examples is an illustrated version that's held in the British Library. As we take our leave of Old English and move forward through history, I thought it appropriate to read the first 2 verses of the Gospel of John. If you don't think too hard as you listen, you'll recognize it as English. To help you out, I'm deliberately reading it to sound a little closer to modern English. Anfrumen was Word, and that Word was mit Gode, and God was that Word. That was Anfrumen mit Gode. Alle thing wären geworte thur hine an nan thing nes gewort, but an him. English experienced a major linguistic change in the 11th century when a fellow from northern France named William crossed the English Channel in 1066 and defeated Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings. Both William and Harold had claims to the English throne, which recently had become vacant upon the death of the previous king, Edward the Confessor. William, known to us today as William the Conqueror, was crowned King of England on Christmas Day 1066. Since he was already Duke of Normandy, England now had a strong tie to northern France. If you've ever read the Robin Hood stories or seen one of the film adaptations, you know the rest of the tale. The invading Normans essentially took political control of England and imported a continental culture that spoke an ancestor of modern French. The English language changed in response to this shift in the balance of power and moved into a phase that linguists call Middle English. Even today, you can see the effects of this linguistic blending in our vocabulary. Some words clearly have an Anglo-Saxon origin, while others obviously come from France. And that's enough for today. Next time, we're going to look at a very famous translation of the Bible into Middle English. We'll also meet the man who instigated it and is considered by many to be a precursor of the Reformation. So until next time, I'm Don Congdon and this is Present Perfect. Have a great day. Present Perfect is a copyright of Don Congdon. Music is copyright Footage Firm Incorporated. Scripture quotations are from the New American Standard Bible, which is a copyright of the Lockman Foundation.